Noam Chomsky has been described as one of the greatest minds in human history.
He's the sort of the greatest exponent of natural philosophy in the 20th and 21st century. It was quite remarkable what he's done.
He is a quite extraordinary human being in every respect, both intellectually and personally.
He's known for his writing on language and his views on America's actions abroad, especially in the Middle East.
Noam Chomsky is important for many decades.
Now in his late 80s, Chomsky is still emeritus professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston.
نعم شومسكي أعتقد اليوم هو أهم من وثق الانتهاكات الإنسانية للولايات المتحدة عبر العالم منذ الستينيات لحد اليوم.
He first emerged through his pioneering work in linguistics in the 1950s, but then became a political activist. For 50 or more years, he's opposed US foreign policy, its neoliberal capitalism, and the mainstream media.
It's always inspiring to listen to him, and trying to argue against him nearly always leads to progress. There's no other linguist like that.
My parents were Hebrew teachers, so I grew up in a Jewish environment, very much imbued with the revival of Hebrew and so on. But my closest relatives were mostly working class, unemployed, mostly in the 1930s. So unemployed Jewish working class, part of the active, very active intellectual community of working class community in New York at the time. People didn't have much formal education. In fact, one uncle who was very influential in my life never got past 4th grade, but a real high culture. So a lot of discussions about the latest performance of the Budapest String Quartet, the Shakespeare play, Freud and Steckel's debates, every variety of radical thought you can imagine. And just a kind of a lively environment. 12 years old or so, I was spending a lot of my time in downtown New York. In those days, there was on 4th Avenue, right below Union Square, there was a string of secondhand bookstores, mostly run by European emigres, a lot of them refugees from Spain that fled from the Francos during the Civil War. A lot of them were anarchists, and I got involved in anarchist and left Marxist literature and thought. They were very eager to talk. Young kid comes in, they're happy to talk, and anarchist offices and so on. And we just became involved in active political life.
Chomsky has been almost as prolific a writer as he has been controversial. His early books on linguistics were influential, but largely academic, with a tiny readership. But his writing on the Middle East gained attention beyond academia. Despite his Jewish origins, he became an increasing critic of Israeli policy towards the Palestinians and of US foreign policy as a whole. In the late 40s, he'd funded his university studies by teaching Hebrew and was primarily interested in learning Arabic. But he was persuaded by one of his teachers, Zelig Harris, to major in linguistics.
Chomsky says somewhere, I'm some sort of anarchist. And it's clear that his anarchism is reflected in a revolt against authority. And the revolt against authority, again, is something that generalizes to the academic disciplines of linguistics and philosophy. So he began his linguistic career by working first with Zelig Harris and then alone on the morphophonemics of Hebrew and on a wide variety of other subjects, culminating in syntactic structures in '57. That book was revolutionary.
I read extensively in classics and modern literature and political writings, mostly on the left, philosophy, sure. It led in directions which had a lot of influence in shaping the way I think about things. The first article I wrote was in 1939, in fourth grade, actually, a fourth grade newspaper, which I was the editor and probably the only reader, maybe my mother. It was an article on the fall of Barcelona, so I remember the exact date, February 1939, and the spread of fascism in Europe. And I was interested and concerned about those things. And I happened to be in the school that I was in was very supportive and encouraging in these respects, not the political side, but just it was a Deweyite experimental school which encouraged creativity, independence, pursuing your interests wherever they would go, and so on, which very much fit my own personal tastes, so it worked out very well. In the 1940s, I was a Zionist youth leader. To me, it was a large part of my political life. To me, Zionism and to my circles meant establishment of a cultural center and national home in Palestine, opposed to a Jewish state, and as I mentioned before, in cooperation with the indigenous population, so Arab, Jewish, mainly working class cooperation.
He had read all of Zionist literature by the age of 5, and he had resolved that he was a Zionist, and he remained so. It's not so much Chomsky versus Zionism, it's Chomsky who considers himself both a Zionist and maintains the same principles and values when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict as he does to any other conflict. And so he applies those principles and values and reaches the same sorts of what you might call radical conclusions as he does when he addresses any other conflict.
In 1953, Chomsky and his wife Carol went to Israel to live on a kibbutz. Already immersed in radical politics, Chomsky visited activists in neighboring Arab villages. Before 1948, he'd already argued publicly for a single or binational state in Palestine. It's been his view of the ideal solution for 75 years, but he now accepts it would condemn Palestinians to living in a virtual apartheid society. Chomsky might have stayed in Israel, but in 1955 he was offered a job at MIT in Boston as an assistant professor. Here he published his first work in linguistics, the basis of which was termed generative grammar, studying grammar as a body of knowledge possessed by language users. He argued this knowledge is innate, and that children therefore need to learn very few features of their native languages, which is why they learn to speak them so quickly.
In the 50s, I started linguistics, and after I graduated, my teacher took me aside and said, "The future is going to be generative." And that was the first time I heard the word or heard generative grammar. And it was only later that I began to understand what Chomsky had contributed. And because of that, I went to MIT for 2 years in the 60s to work with Chomsky and study with him.
I was given a book by my father by Chomsky, which was published in the same year, 2002, and I read this book and was, first of all, I was struck by several things. The first thing I was struck by was that he hadn't been on a single reading list, even though I'd been studying issues about politics and social justice and so on. And secondly, I was struck by how assertive his voice was, how clear, how he could say such assertive things about how America performed in its foreign policy and so on.
Norman Finkelstein has also faced controversy. A dispute with lawyer Alan Dershowitz ultimately cost him his job at DePaul University.
Chomsky changed my life, but the fact is he did, and I have to give credit where credit is due. I was coming under a quite severe battering. My ego was being pretty much shattered from all the criticism I had to absorb. And the only compensatory factor was the knowledge that one of the greatest minds in human history thought I had something to say. And so he lifted my spirits through some very, very difficult periods. Were it not for him, I can tell you with certainty that although I'm a pretty determined person, I would have given up.
Well, I heard about him in the 1970s and even earlier in the late 1960s. I had heard that there was this professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, who was also a political activist. And I was interested in his political writings. And I wrote to him after reading one of his books. And quite to my surprise, he responded. And we began a correspondence then. And it continued.
أذكر عندما كنت طالبا في الماجستير كنت قد راسلته، كتبت له بعض الرسائل عن بعض المشاكل السياسية التي كانت تصادفنا في ذلك الوقت، وأنا أذكر أنه كان يجيب على رسائلي يعني في غضون أيام بسيطة، وكان يطبع الرسالة على آلته الكاتبة يدويا في ذلك الوقت، ويقال أنه كان يمضي أكثر من 20 ساعة أسبوعيا في الرد على الرسائل التي كانت تصله من ناشطين سياسيا أو من تلاميذ.
I spend a lot of time responding to mail, and a lot of it is critical. I mean, like I might spend 5 or 6 hours a day responding to mail, but it's of all kinds. Some is criticism, some is requests for information, some is proposals, some is people write about their own problems. I don't really spend a lot of time responding to criticism. Most of the criticism that's published, I read it, and if there's anything interesting, maybe I can learn something from it. Okay, I'll accept it if it's interesting. If it's just nonsense, I ignore it. I rarely respond, unless I'm asked to. In fact, it's interesting what happens when I do respond. So, for example, the Columbia Journalism Review, which is the main journalism review, the most important one, they happen to have an interview which was full of outlandish slanders and fabrications about me, which I ignored. But friends of mine in the profession said they thought it would be worth answering because a lot of people read it. So I wrote a response to the Columbia Journalism Review, and they published it almost. They rewrote it. They changed what I wrote and put in their own sentences. And then they had a response to this letter in which they responded to the sentences that they had introduced. And I wrote a letter to the editor, and I said, "You really think this is honest journalistic practice?" And I think it was a woman wrote back saying, "Well, we thought those sentences we introduced expressed your views better than you did, so it was appropriate."
His debates with people are generally not personal. He's really interested in the ideas that he's talking about, and he wants to engage with those ideas. And he believes that his interlocutors, the people he speaks with, are deserving of respect, which does not mean that he should agree with them or that he can't criticize what they're saying, but he doesn't tend to criticize them. He criticizes what they're saying and what they're asserting. And this actually is quite unique.
I have a sort of a schizophrenic existence. I mean, part of it is my sort of roughly professional work, scientific work. And there I write if there's something to say. So I think I understand something, or there's discovery, or so on. Well, okay, you write it down. Actually, I never, my earliest writings were not intended for publication, and that stays pretty much the same. So the first linguistic book I wrote was written for 20 friends. Never expected it would be published. In fact, it wasn't published until 20 years later. The first one that actually came out, publication in 1957, was Syntactic Structures. It was actually class notes. It was notes for an undergraduate class that I was teaching here, and the publisher saw them and asked if I could, suggested I write it up, and they would publish it, but it wasn't intended for publication. And many of the other things that I write are either lectures, class notes, something like this, put together when it looks as if it's appropriate. And it's pretty much the same in the other sphere, in the political sphere. And most of what I write, occasionally I'll sort of sit down and decide I'm going to write a book about X, Y, Z, but a lot of it is edited versions of talks, hundreds of talks, put together, often at the request of a publisher. But it's just another form of reaching out to a wider audience. Most of it's speaking.
Greetings and welcome to Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. Today on Alternative Radio, we're going to feature... That's how he expresses himself. He is prolific. He is able to write on linguistics as well as political issues. He has a lot to say. He knows a lot. And he is able to produce many, many books and articles. It's extraordinary. And the intellectual output of Chomsky has few rivals anywhere.
When I'm driving home, I'm thinking, and if there's anything worth putting down, I'll write it. Okay. I don't think there's anything profound to say about these matters. If I answer a letter from somebody who has a query or a comment or a criticism and so on, and it leads me to think about something, and I think about it, and maybe I'll write it down. The same if I'm having a discussion with, say, a student comes in with his draft of his thesis, and we talk about something, and something comes up, well, maybe I'll write that down.
Syntactic structures, aspects of a theory of syntax, lectures of government and binding, the minimalist program, these are 4 landmark books in linguistics. He's written a large number of very important books in philosophy, including Language and Mind and Reflections on Language and the recent Cambridge volume. And as you know, as well as I do, that he's written countless pages of very influential work in politics. My own favorite, actually, is Peace in the Middle East.
Certainly the book that had the biggest impact on me was Fateful Triangle. That was a tour de force. It really was. It was, he wrote the whole thing in about 6 months at night after work. And it's really endured. I remember just a funny story. I gave it to my late mother to read, and she read it and devoured it as fast, if not faster than me. And the book is very heavily documented with Hebrew Israeli sources. So she once went to a presentation about Professor Chomsky, attacking Professor Chomsky by an Israeli ambassador at the local library, an Israeli, from the Israeli embassy. And she attended the presentation. And the guy was defending Israel. And so my mother said, well, what about what Professor Chomsky says in Fateful Triangle? And the person says, oh, Professor Chomsky, crazy. So my mother says, what do you mean crazy? All of his sources are Israeli.
I suppose the book that had the biggest impact on me was a collection of essays, Language and Politics, which was edited by Carlos Otero, and it's a huge book. It's one of the earliest books by Chomsky I bought. But in fact, it was very good as an introduction because it was a series of interviews that he'd done over many, many years, and as a consequence, it was extremely accessible and gave you a broad sense of the vast scope of Chomsky's interests. So for me, if I was to pick out one book of his that I was taking to a desert island, it would be Language and Politics, which is still available, I think, through AK Press.
In the academic domain, either Reflections on Language or Rules and Representations are the best books. And they're the best books because they're philosophically deep, but they're accessible to a reasonably unsophisticated audience.
Everyone's impressed by the fact that he documents almost everything he says. I mean, the footnotes are almost as impressive as the book. And it's clearly the writing of someone who's thought seriously about these topics and wants to share what he believes is the case with you. I think that's true in everything of his that I've read. I just don't think there's anything trivial about the man. And that's not something you can say about most people.
He writes whenever he has free time. But I must say, as a critic of his writing, that he does not have the most fluent writing style. The sentences tend to be very long. I prefer shorter and crisper writing. But that is his style, and that's what he's been doing for many years.
His books are deceptively simple. Sometimes people think they're just a massive accumulation of facts and footnotes. Now, there is a massive accumulation of facts and footnotes. There is a quantity of research which is almost terrifying. There is a Nobel laureate in biology named Salvador Luria, who was a personal friend of Chomsky. And in his autobiography, he referred to Chomsky's terrifying storehouse of knowledge. And it's true, there is a terrifying storehouse of knowledge there. Because Chomsky, his mind operates like it's a decomposing machine. Wherever he goes, whatever he looks at, literally, whatever he looks at, he intellectually decomposes it.
Much of what I write, most of it probably is with small publishers of one kind or another. So, for example, the first book I wrote, first book I wrote on Israel-Palestine, the publisher who published most of what I was doing didn't want to publish it, so it appeared in France, in French translation. And then after it appeared in French translation, they agreed to publish it here. The second book, there was no publishers. There was a small cooperative press, South End Press, so they published it. And it continues. It's not censorship, it's just these are the constraints through which dissident opinion has to move. I mean, sometimes there is.
Marred by academics for his pioneering work in linguistics, generative grammar, and by activists worldwide for his unwavering criticism of US foreign policy, its neoliberal economics, and its mainstream media.
He wasn't really ignored at the very beginning because he had already had a reputation from his linguistics and also from his criticism of Vietnam. So at the beginning, it was kind of hard to ignore him because of his stature. He began to be ignored, you could say, probably beginning in the early 1980s, where he came out with a really excellent book, The Fateful Triangle.
In the United States, maybe you get slandered or denounced or kept out of the press and so on. In the old Soviet Union, you could end up in the Gulag. If you're in a typical American dependency, like say El Salvador, you get your brains blown out. It differs from society to society. But it's never an honored profession, and how could it be? It's condemning power systems. So of course it's not approved.
Greetings and welcome to Alternative Radio. I'm David Barsamian. Today on Alternative Radio, anyone in U.S. Political culture who swims against the current, who goes against the tide, is going to be marginalized to a certain extent, because the truths that Chomsky articulates are very unpopular. He was, let's say, segmented or isolated simply as a linguistics professor, and his political work and analysis was largely ignored, marginalized, and derided in many instances. There were a lot of the so-called liberals, Martin Peretz, Paul Berman, and others, Irving Howe, Crystal, they all were very hostile to Chomsky's ideas.
جريدة نيويورك تايمز ترفض نشر أي مقال لنعوم تشومسكي منذ عشرات السنين نتيجة مواقفه المناوئة للولايات المتحدة. فعلى الرغم من أن نعوم تشومسكي يعتبر مؤسسة في علم اللغويات في جامعة MIT في ماساتشوستس في بوسطن، هو أصبح أيضا مؤسسة لليسار، إن كان يسار ليبرالي أو حتى اليسار الليبرالية في الولايات المتحدة، اليسار المناوئ للإمبريالية الأمريكية. فعنده شهرة طبعا عالمية، ولكن في نفس الوقت هو غير محتفى به من قبل المؤسسات الرسمية ولا من قبل الإعلام الرسمي أو الليبرالي مثل الواشنطن بوست أو نيويورك تايمز أو المؤسسات الموالية للحكم في الولايات المتحدة والتي ترفض أن تنتقد السياسات الخارجية نقد راديكالي للولايات المتحدة كما يقوم به نعوم تشومسكي في كتاباته.
He's shut down in other ways, in the sense that the media don't review his books and academics don't treat him seriously and so on. But because he's nevertheless able to publish his books, able to give talks, able to be on independent radio and so on, people do get to hear his ideas and they do feel supported by that, and they do appreciate that somebody is actually voicing, making a criticism. And I think as he sees it, offering an alternative historical account of events, not the mainstream account of history. So he's putting forward a different version of history.
I think one of the reasons they ignored him is because of what he stood for in their eyes. He stood for their youthful ideals, their youthful principles, their youthful commitments to truth and justice, all of which they had effectively abandoned, and they joined the ruling, the intellectual establishment, the ruling establishment. And so they didn't want to be reminded about Chomsky. And whenever they would say, oh, Professor Chomsky, his ideas are so infantile, simplistic. That's one of the words they always like to use, simplistic. Because now they're more attuned to the subtleties and complexities of power, which Professor Chomsky doesn't understand. Well, of course, he understands them perfectly. He just happens not to give in to them.
In fact, when I first started to write about Chomsky, I wrote to him with an outline of the project that I was interested in writing. And this was in the days before email, and I received a very long letter back from him typed, explaining to me why he thought I shouldn't do the project because it would create trouble for me and make me unpopular. This, at the time, I was somewhat surprised with, but given the hostility with which he is often greeted by intellectuals, I can see why he sent that now.
There has been an attempt to marginalise him in certain areas in the States, and that marginalisation is almost certainly due to the fact that people feel threatened by what he's done. And they feel threatened for the sort of reasons we've gone into. His acting as conscience of the West means that because it's conscious and it's part of the conscience, it now is accessible and difficult to hide. So unless you can marginalize him, there's an implication that something has to be done.
Incidentally, just as a factual point, where everything changed for him politically. Because I had his wife, Caro, used to manage all of his literary output, which was very substantial. We're talking about, now it's over 100 books. But she was able to manage everything until 9/11. That was the turning point. After that pamphlet he wrote on 9/11, then his books went off the chart and they had to hire somebody to handle his literary production. Up to then, the sales were not very high. I mean, of course, they were large because of the number of books, but they weren't very high. So that's when he took off in terms of his publications. And now he's still ignored. That's true. Yeah, he's still ignored. But he's ignored and he's getting recognition at the same time. Both are happening. He's getting academic recognition and he's still ignored in the media.
His book on 9/11, for example, which came out after the 9/11 events, came to number 3 in the popular best-selling list. So Ordinary People, but it had no marketing. It was not, heralded as a book that everybody, the media did not put it forward as a book to read, and yet it got to number 3. So Ordinary People are very interested in his ideas, but the media, academics, and of course government, the 3 group of elites, don't want to look at his work.
Well, that's an important event. We might ask, incidentally, which 9/11? The 2. One of them entered history, one didn't. The one that entered history is September 11th, 2001. Okay, we know what happened then. It's supposed to have changed the world and so on. There was another 9/11, September 11th, 1973. And now let's imagine, let's do a thought experiment. Suppose on what we call 9/11, suppose that Al-Qaeda had bombed the White House, killed the president, established a military dictatorship, killed thousands of people, tortured tens of thousands, established an international terrorist center that was carrying out assassinations and overthrowing governments all over the world, and establishing murderous national security states. Just imagine that. That would have been worse than what we call 9/11. Now, it's not imaginary, it happened. It happened on September 11th, 1973, with the US-backed coup in Chile. That's exactly that's what I was describing. But we don't call that 9/11 because we were responsible for it. It enters history when somebody does something to us, not when we do something to others, which is much worse often. That's blundering efforts to do good, as Anthony Lewis called it. So sure, the first 9/11 had a huge impact on history, but few people in the West would even know what it is. The second 9/11 was targeted against the West, so therefore it's very significant. In fact, it aroused enormous sympathy throughout the world.
I've read somewhere that he looked at himself in the mirror during the Vietnam War and realised that he could either remain silent and be quiet despite his clear criticism of what was going on in Vietnam, or he could make a public stand and use his public position to have a voice on matters that were very dear to him. And so he chose to use much of his time to explore and critique American foreign policy.
He's one of those very few people, I can't really think of another, who managed to create a global reputation for himself, including a very substantial reputation in the United States, without having any access to the mainstream media. And remember, that was before internet already, before internet, so it's not as if there was an alternative media available. He just worked through his own or through alternative circuits and managed to plug into a huge following, notwithstanding the fact that he was never on television, never on national radio. It was really a remarkable achievement, and the achievement is due to 2 things. One, he had a very unique message which managed to get out, and also his own intrepidness, that by constantly speaking to little audiences often.
In politics, I think one of the issues about Chomsky's work that makes it important is that he focuses on current issues and detail. He doesn't write for an academic audience, so his books, in a way, will probably not last in the way that the books of other intellectuals will. He writes about the specific details of the here and now because he's interested in bringing about change in society. So the books, in a way, are a bit like toolkits for political activists around the world. That's who he writes for, and that's what he hopes to achieve. And I think that that's hugely significant because most intellectuals do not have that kind of audience. They write, in a way, for other intellectuals.
As I chose to engage the issues long before I ever heard of linguistics or even thought of going to college. I was doing it as a child. So I just continued doing it. I mean, you know, the fact that you're, let's say, a specialist in 17th century English literature, or that you work on quantum theory or something, that doesn't prevent you from being a human being. So if you're a human being, you should be interested in issues of human concern. And since if people like us, you know, say professors, are privileged, you know, very privileged, privilege confers opportunities, opportunities confer responsibility. Then you make your choices. But I don't regard it as, the question that should be asked is, why doesn't everybody do it?
Chomsky lost his wife, Carol, to cancer in 2008. They'd known one another since he was 5, and she'd been his constant supporter, however unpopular his views among the American establishment. His advancing years have not diminished his capacity for analysis or his determination to continue to rail against what he sees as the iniquities of the day. In 2006, he visited El Akhayam Detention Center in South Lebanon with the prominent Hezbollah figure Nabil Qaouk. Al Akhayam was used by the South Lebanon Army and Israel as a prison camp during the Israeli occupation from 1985 to 2000. When Chomsky attempted to cross into the occupied West Bank to lecture at Birzeit University, he was interrogated about his views on Israeli policy before being refused entry. Undeterred, he returned to Jordan and gave his lectures via video conference to his audience at Birzeit.
Well, there are two kinds of intellectuals. There's the type that does research and teaches seminars and gives lectures and is not connected with any movements. And then you have the type of intellectual that Chomsky represents, where he has historically always made his knowledge available to movements, to activists, because knowledge that is simply inert and is not being used by popular groups in movements, I think is not something that attracts him. He wants to be a spark, a catalyst.
هنالك نوع من الجبن السياسي في المؤسسة الأكاديمية الأمريكية حتى من قبل الأساتذة أو المفكرين الذين يكتبون في سياق نقدي عن الولايات المتحدة. هنالك جبن من الانخراط في العمل السياسي بشكل عام نتيجة يعني عدم أو الخوف من خسارة الاحترام الأكاديمي داخل المؤسسة. طبعا نعوم تشومسكي استطاع أن يكسب احترام المؤسسة الأكاديمية في أعماله الأكاديمية في علم اللسانيات، وإن خسر احترام المؤسسات الرسمية الأمريكية نتيجة مواقفه المعادية لإمبرياليات الولايات المتحدة.
What I would say about Chomsky is he's in constant communication with the activists. That's who he speaks for, that's who he encourages. He's not in his political life. In his political life, his primary audience is not journals, intellectual journals, and he's not out to attend wine and cheese parties and these kinds of academic conferences. In his political life, his primary aim seems to have been to encourage activists, people who are trying to, in a real way, trying to change the world. And that makes him completely in a different category than most other academic leftists.
He's often described as a self-hating Jew, and that's, if you know him, it's clearly false. He was a member of the Jewish community. He was brought up as a practicing Jew, even though he's himself an atheist. But he is part of Jewish culture. He speaks very highly of his uncle, of his parents, who were practicing Jews. And I think that he practices what he preaches. He preaches equality. He preaches the importance of taking things at their face value, or at least as though there was a universal justice.
The fact that Chomsky is Jewish is secondary. What I think is more important is the justice of the Palestinian cause. And from the very beginning of his political activism, he was always interested in and concerned about Palestine. And there are few in the United States who have been as strong an ally and friend of the Palestinian people as has Noam Chomsky. He's written many books. One of his first books was called Peace in the Middle East. It came out in 1974 and 1975. He's written on the topic extensively. Fateful Triangle is a classic work on the history of Israel and Palestine.
أنا أعتقد أن موقفه من موضوع فلسطين إسرائيل لا يختلف عن موقفه من العالم الثالث بشكل عام، أي أنه يهاجم أعداء العالم الثالث دون أن يكون بالضرورة مساندا حركات التحرر الموجودة لأسبابه الخاصة أو أسباب سياسية مختلفة. ومنها من عام 2006 اختلافه مع الكثيرين من المساندين للشعب الفلسطيني في مثلا حق العودة. فبينما هو يساند الحق القانوني للعودة للشعب الفلسطيني الذي هجر عن بلاده في 48، يرفض طرح حق العودة كحق يمكن إنجازه أو حق يمكن استرجاعه.
I happen to advocate a binational federation and a single state, but we have to distinguish between advocacy and proposal. You know, we can propose that everybody should live in peace, and it's a nice proposal. It rises to the level of advocacy when you sketch a path from here to there. Okay, same with binational state, what's called a one-state settlement. You can propose it, like you can propose that everyone should live in peace. In fact, you can make a better proposal, a no-state solution, in which you simply erase national boundaries. Something like what existed under the Ottoman Empire, without its corruption and brutality, where you could go from Cairo to Baghdad to Istanbul without crossing any borders, and where, you know, people could run their own affairs in their own neighborhoods and so on. Yeah, you can advocate, you can propose that too.
يرفض نعوم تشومسكي الاقتراحات الموجودة عن الدولة الواحدة، دولة واحدة في إسرائيل لمواطنيها. طبعا لا يرفضه من حيث المبدأ، يقول أن هذا مرفوض لأن ليس هنالك إجماعا عالميا عليه وأن إسرائيل لن تسمح به. ولكن طبعا من كان يعتقد أن الدولة العنصرية، دولة الأبارتهايد في جنوب أفريقيا، كانت ستسمح في يوم من الأيام أن ينتهي نظامها كما انتهى.
In Peace in the Middle East, he made the observation that Israel has a choice. It can remain a democratic country, or it can remain a country with the territories. It can't do both. And he said that if it tried to do both, it would be moving in the direction of an apartheid-like state. That was said in '68. That was unbelievably prescient. And I think that's basically the argument that's now being made by everybody in the United States, but for that matter in Israel. Chomsky invented modern linguistics. It wouldn't have existed without him. It's the way we like to put it sometimes, all of us who are doing contemporary linguistics are playing in the playpen or the sandbox that Chomsky created. He defined the problem. He defined the class of solutions. He defined the possible options for investigating these class of solutions. Without him, it wouldn't exist. He just is modern linguistics.
He is like a guide to exploring the world, the political world, particularly of the United States. And that has not been by accident. I mean, that has been the result of decades and decades of a tremendous commitment and dedication to writing about and speaking about United States foreign policy, U.S. economic policy, the media in the United States, the role of the media, the role of the academy, the colleges and universities, the whole idea of manufacturing consent and propaganda.
Chomsky has changed the way we see ourselves. We used to be some kind of malleable blank slate on which could be written whatever the people in authority wanted to be written. Chomsky changed that. And just as Darwin changed our view about the position of human beings in evolution, Chomsky has changed our view of what it is to be a mind-bearing entity. We have an innate makeup which is characterized by a craving for freedom.
I don't know anyone who works as hard as Noam Chomsky. I mean, whenever I feel sorry for myself, you know, I'm working too hard or I'm too tired, I think of Chomsky and what he does, and I feel ashamed that I'm doing nothing, because I know that he only sleeps a few hours a night. And this issue of responding to people is extraordinary.
Stop writing when I have nothing more to say. I suppose I'll keep writing. Now, there's plenty of things in the back of my mind I'd like to get to and write up.